And one of the things though that Asha has done is through her writing, her own, I don't want to call it confessional, it's a memoir, it's reflection, but in some ways it is a confessional space as well. You've modeled a certain kind of practice of revealing the self, risking the self, not for indulgence, but to open up a bigger question, whether it's mass incarceration, whether it's parenting, all these things. When you get the call from Patrice, what are you thinking?
It's a good question. You know, let me put a little bit more context on it. There were other things that were happening, and sometimes terrorism doesn't show up in a Donald Trump or in a military tank. Sometimes it shows up as someone who's at our rally and takes credit for our work and erases the labor, the sweat, the pain, the history of Black women. That's why I was so moved, you know, by the poet. And surely, Mark, you know, that was what was happening with Patrice and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi, the three Black women who founded Black Lives Matter.
All right.
And what happened what happened in Ferguson a year after Black Lives Matter was founded was that NBC News decided one person was the spokesperson, a man who was not a member of Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to tell you he wasn't there. He was. We all saw him. We saw the vest. But he began to take credit for work that he didn't do. And not only was he taking, in many ways, credit for work that Alicia and Patrice and Opal had created, but also for the 80% of Black women who were on actually the ground in Ferguson, Black women who were trans, who had come from Ohio and risked their bodies to stand in unfamiliar streets where they didn't know how they would be welcomed. All Black women took a stand in Ferguson, 80%, just as it was during the Civil Rights Movement, just as it was to give birth to the Civil Rights Movement. And so, you know, it became important, you know, to your first part of your question, is that there's never a wrong time, really, for the truth, right? Never really a wrong time to document history. And then, you know, in terms of this being more of a memoir, there's, you know, just two pieces to that. First, I think that there are a lot of people, including my own daughter, who feel very much a member of Black Lives Matter and will have their own perspectives. There had already been books out, your masterful take on much of what was happening in the world, certainly many books. And so I think that in having a subtitle, A Black Lives Matter memoir, is a call to people to let 1,000 flowers bloom. Tell all the stories. How many biographies do we have of Lincoln? Let's have a lot of stories, right? And, you know, the other piece is that we don't get to see people's humanity. We get to see caricatures. We get to see bots half the time. But Patrice's vulnerability in demonstrating that this was a human being that was being denigrated and having her work erased. And these were human beings who were murdered, somebody's child, was exceptionally important. And Patrice's ability to walk through fear and pain and relive a lot of trauma, was one of the most courageous acts I've ever had the honor to bear witness to.
Let's talk about some of those courageous acts in the book, particularly the first half. Again, your book for me stands in a tradition of powerful Black women, freedom fighters, who, as Asha points to, have found a way to tell their story without being narcissistic or self-indulgent, but to advance something bigger. Asada did that. Angela Davis did that, who wrote the wonderful foreword to this book, which you have to read as well. And then you're in this book, and you're risking the self to tell these stories. One of the things you talk about, first of all, is this relationship to your father. And I know it's a difficult thing to talk about. Can you talk a little bit about what that relationship was like and how that shaped how you understood not just yourself, but your relationship to the work you do?
Yes. I mean, I grew up with two fathers. One who raised me and was a big masculine man, and then would cry at the drop of a hat. That's the kind of men I grew up with. And then my other father was my biological father, who I wouldn't meet until I'm 11 years old. I detail in the book, who was a recovering drug addict, and in his recovery became very central to how I understand my own vulnerability. There's a saying in 12 Steps, which is, you're as sick as your secrets. Mm-hmm. And my father, and his vulnerability and in his rage and his everything he was trying to figure out, really showed me the impact his own childhood had on him, showed me the impact being pushed into a certain type of masculinity and patriarchy had on him. And while it took a while for us to get to know each other, and he spent a better part of my years inside a jail cell, we really developed our relationship through letter writing, and when he would come home, spending lots and lots of time with my family. And there's something really special about being able to have a parent apologize, mm-hmm. and hold themselves accountable for the trauma that they may have created in your life. And there was, he became an example of what is possible for an adult, for a grown Black man in particular. And he is a character in the story that you get to see all of him. And I think part of being Black, in America, is we don't get to be vulnerable. That is that's the part that gets sacrificed. And vulnerability is such a key thing if we want to heal and be whole. And that, when Asha and I were developing the book, we had all these themes, like what are the major themes? And one of them was around healing justice. I didn't call it that as when I was younger, but I deeply believed in the need to heal, to also forgive, and in transformative justice, and the idea that maybe the system will never see Black people as redeemable, maybe the system will never see us as human, but we can. We get to offer that to one another.
Was it one of the things that struck me in the book was, before you get to the stage of forgiveness, before you get to the stage of healing, there's this jarring interruption to your life. He's just coming home.
Yeah.
I don't want to ruin the whole book. But I'm just really, I found that so stunning. Can you talk just a little bit about what that meant to have yet another father figure emerge seemingly out of nowhere?
I wasn't interested, to be honest with you. I really liked my other father. He was fun and charismatic, and I always tell Asha if they met each other, they would fall in love. They have very similar energies, just super fun and super caring, and I had a very deep relationship with him, and I think in a way, I did become his favorite because he knew that I wasn't his blood and never wanted me to feel like I was something different. So we had this very, very particular relationship, and when my mother tells me I have another father, the sort of rote response was to say, okay, I want to meet him, but I didn't actually really want to meet him. I wanted things to go back to where they were. And so it was a challenge those first few years because I didn't call him father. I didn't feel like I was obligated to. He was a stranger. And I didn't know this new person. It was uncomfortable and weird. And I think there's this idea that you have to be, all those Maury Povich shows where adopted folks meet their family and they all run to each other. It's crying. I thought that's what it was going to feel like, and it didn't at all. It was very confusing and disorienting. Well, what do we do now? What do my siblings do? You're not there. I mean, it was just a very confusing dynamic, and it wasn't like someone was sitting me down and be like, all right, how are you feeling? What do you need? It was just like, all right, go meet this dude and y'all figure it out, right?
Asha, you have helped us, both through your writing and through your activism and your policy work, think through the effects of mass incarceration and the drug war and all these other overlapping processes, how they affect families, how they tear families apart. I'm not sure we ever got as much insight from the world about how to put them back together again. Can you talk a little bit about those two things?
Let me see if I'm going to answer this correctly. I mean, I think that number one, we can look throughout the history of Black people in this country and know that there's never been a guaranteed right to family. We've demanded it, pulled it together. At the end of slavery, there's documentation of people walking barefoot 100 miles to find the families that have been taken from them, the children. And immediately post, we had a good 10 good years, I think, during Reconstruction. And then, you had the Black codes that began to separate families again. You had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan that drove domestic terrorism in the South and opened up a migration pattern that separated families again. And so we're in a new iteration of that. And I think that the work that I do around the drug war is very much in response to honoring those who are not here anymore, because the drug war is a proxy for a race war. It was started at a moment when Black people had achieved some of the greatest gains in this country in civil and human rights. And at that very moment, Nixon declares drugs the enemy, and he declares our communities the enemy zone. Of course, John Ehrlichman would say, did we know we were lying? Of course we did. But we did it anyway. And the worst part of it was that we bought into it. We believed the people we once loved, whether they were drug sellers or drug users, should be thrown away. We were silent when 2.2 million people went missing on our watch. We never questioned that more crack and powder cocaine was used in white communities, but they didn't fall apart because they had employee assistance programs and other things to hold them together. We just called people crackheads and dismissed them. I often have said, as Patrice and I have been talking, we can embrace a Killer Mike on Bernie Sanders' political campaign, but if his name had been Crackhead Mike, we wouldn't have. And so we participated, we who are not just Black but progressive, in writing off a whole generation, 2 generations at this point, of people, and has had an extraordinary impact on families, which is also the great importance of Patrice's stories, pulling that apart and demonstrating what Patrice has talked about, which is secondary trauma. And that, when you disrupt a family or one person, you put them in prison, the kind of trauma that leaves children and others in is almost immeasurable.
You said something about throwing people away that I have found resonant throughout the book and also throughout these last 3 or 4 years, really, since Black Lives Matter has been at the forefront of our conversation. That's this idea of disposability. And it seems there's a way that we are willing to throw people away, not just people who are mass incarcerated, although we do, not just people who are addicted to drugs, not just LGBT folk, but even each other, even other activists. Even someone says something out of step, someone makes a mistake, we drag, we call them out, we throw them away. To what do you attribute that culture, and how can we work through that? Because that seems to be a big thing, and it's something you've been resistant to. I mean, part of your work has been to say we can't throw each other away.
We live in a culture that is a bullying culture, and we should know that. I remember being a child in school, Mark, and learning about Pax Romana. and learning that there was 200 years of peace in the ancient Rome. And as a little girl, I thought, what's the big deal about that? Don't fight for a while. And then if we fast forward and think about America, and from the 20th century onward, when have we not been at war? Whether we were aware of it, it was declared, through the first couple of world wars, the Spanish America, we just go on and on. The wars that were never claimed, the bombings that have gone on that we haven't talked about. And so embedded in this very culture is the idea of throwing people away. And now we've given, sort of different platforms to turn up, as Patrice will, we've experienced recently, and just, dismiss people. And, we're products of this society. We're product. We can't talk about the way I don't believe we can talk about the way that any number of young activists behave when in fact they were thrown away, right? In fact, they were told they didn't matter. They were told it when they walked into school buildings that looked like prisons. They were told it when they had to go through metal detectors. They were told it when they didn't have adequate food, many of them. They were told it when they had teachers that didn't care about them, when they learned the wrong things. A boy in the 9th grade, 9 years old, being asked the other day, what are the 3 good things about slavery? They're told it. This happened. This happened last week.
Exactly.
So we're constantly being told, you're disposable. And so it's our job, and I want you to take it from here, really, Patrice, it's our job to disrupt that at every single turn, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when, you gotta resist. I have an inner petty. And I like holding a grudge. It feels good sometimes, but it's not actually, what was going to get us free, and ultimately that's what we have to keep our eye on.
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last few years, what I've witnessed specifically on social media is we've used dragging culture. Anything can turn bad fast. But I think about the sort of like early days of Black Twitter that was really using dragon culture to challenge corporations,
right?
To challenge white trolls. How many times did you get a death threat and you find that person on social media and you're like, you're silly, you didn't realize that you emailed me from your work email. Let's email the company, which I think is a great way to drag.
Absolutely.
But when it turns into that is the way in which you relate to people, I think there's becomes a culture where the dragging culture is almost like you get points for it. How well you turn up, how quickly you drag someone. And frankly, I don't think social media is a great platform to try to engage around some of these big issues. I think some of this stuff has to happen like this.
Absolutely.
And I think we've really devolved in our ability to debate politically and to have some really rich political debates happened where folks were like, I don't agree with that. All right, let's duke it out on stage. Let's have a conversation about it. Right. And I wish we were there. I wish we could have a political debate without it turning into something actual personal beef.
Right.
And I think we have to create that. We have to be able to turn the culture around. And the way I do that, and some people don't like it, is I don't drag people. I don't drag Black people on social media. I won't. And I don't participate in it. And if I see people participating in it, I try to have a conversation with them. Can we do this differently? But I do think that when people feel like the only way they can get heard or seen is by turning up, it becomes hard not to do that. It becomes hard not to feel like that is your first response to something.
Yeah.
Mark, Patrice, I would ask you, do you think that, this is like a moment to imagine what success and winning looks like in a very different way, right? And I think it's not this one-upmanship, which comes also out of a culture of playing the dozens that was harmless at a certain point. But it's like, how do we imagine winning without harming someone else? And I don't think that we have a paradigm for that to return to, which is again what I think is so important in your story, you know, Patrice, is that winning looks different, success looks different. We have to have new models of what success looks like.
And that's one of the things I want to ask you, because it seems to me that some of the one-upmanship is a very hyper-masculine. And so patriarchal. I ain't got to agree that quick. But it's a very particular understanding of what leadership looks like, what activism looks like, etc. And so I think part of what your work does, what your intervention did as Black Lives Matter, and even when you talk about the second half of the book, the significance of 3 Black women leading this isn't just that we change the face of leadership, but there might be a new... Yes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The how. Yeah, and I've actually talked about this a lot, which is I'm not interested in getting somewhere and while I got there, I trampled on people, they trampled on me. We hate each other now, and now we have a new world, but we all hate each other. That's possible, right? I'm not saying that conflict isn't going to happen. I actually think conflict can be extremely generative, but I think we have to practice it that way. And we're used to getting upset or feeling some kind of way about something, and then it's a moral judgment on someone else. Instead, what I try to offer folks, and you have to be ready to do this, because sometimes you can offer it prematurely, and I've definitely been in a dynamic where I'm like, okay, we're all going to do this mediated thing, and I'm like, oh, none of you actually want to do this. Like, we have to want to forgive. We have to want to transform. We have to believe that it's possible, and we have to feel less interested in our ego's response, less interested in our emotional response, and think literally about what's bigger. And that's not to take away the impact it has on us. What I hope for is that we can get to a place where we hold ourselves accountable, and people don't have to hold other people accountable. Think about that. Think about a moment when you have done something real terrible, and you know you did, and you hold on to it versus going to the person or going to your staff or whatever and saying, I messed up. That wasn't acceptable. I'm really sorry. Is there something I could do? That's actually really liberating. That's really freeing. But we don't live in a culture where we first take accountability. It often has to be someone else has to hold you accountable. And that's a hard dynamic because we get into roles very quickly as humans, right? If you're the one that's always holding someone accountable, then that's the moment you step in a place, that's what you're thinking about. All right, who do I have to hold accountable here? So I just think that this piece around like being self-accountable is actually really critical.
Absolutely. Talk to me about, I think about every freedom movement, and there's just this moment, every iteration of our freedom struggle, rather, there's a moment, something happens. And it's not necessarily something that hasn't happened before. Emmett Till wasn't the first person killed, et cetera, et cetera. What was your moment of entry into this, and why then do you think?
My brother was my moment. I think, it wasn't something outside of me. It was cumulative and also a moment. And my brother is a victim of police brutality, almost was killed by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. And it was the brutality and the act against him that was so painful. But to be honest with you, what was even more painful was the aftermath. And we don't often talk about this. We talk about the moment someone's killed, or we talk about the moment someone's brutalized, but we don't talk about, what happens afterwards? And what happens to that person, what happens to the community, the family. And I saw the severe impact my brother's brutalization had on all of us. And what it did to my mother, who, my mom was a teenage mom, and she was a single mother, and I saw what it did to me, to my siblings, and I think part of growing up poor and Black is not just being brutalized, but being completely neglected in the aftermath of it, right? And I think that moment for me was they actually don't care about us. And so what are we gonna do? What am I gonna do?
Asha, how about you? Because you've also been doing this for, for a very principled reason. Can you talk just a little bit about what got you into this space and why you do what you do?
It wasn't initially as personal as Patrice has talked about, at least not as I initially perceived it when I was in college in the very, very, very late 80s, very late. What was
December
happening?
89, 31st.
I'm trying to say, recognize. There were a couple of things that were going on. The dollar for dollar amount of money that was being taken out of public higher education was being put into the largest prison expansion New York had ever seen under a Democratic, under any governor, but in this case a Democratic governor, Mario Cuomo. California would soon follow suit. He used the money to build prisons, circumventing the wishes of the voters who had said no on a bond issue to build prisons. And so instead, he went into funds that had been set aside on the day of Martin Luther King's funeral that was meant to build low-income housing and homes for poor people at the beginning of the Poor People's Campaign, and he used it to build prisons. And I was taking a course on Black people and prisons, and I don't know that I didn't necessarily connect personally. I didn't think to it, but I certainly knew as somebody who had spent the earliest years of my life in foster care what it meant to be set aside. I also knew what it meant to be claimed, because I have most incredible parents. And I think that I felt that when I started going up to prisons and teaching and visiting, and then of course, I fell in love with a man who was in a process of transformation, as I was in the process of transformation, and we got married. We have a beautiful daughter. She's sitting here in the front row ignoring us. She's very brilliant. Got accepted into Columbia University. I'm not bragging. Out of the most competitive pool of early decision applicants. I get to say the story my way because I got the mic. But and so it was very clear to me when prisons that they're hidden from our view, as Patrice talks about, and when I went there, I was like, oh damn, everybody here looks like people on my block, right? These aren't people that fell out of the sky. These are people who look like my family, and in fact, they would become my family. I have family in prison, and after I wrote about it, and I would often ask, how many people have someone in prison, because this is now the late 90s and nobody's actually talking about this stuff, one hand would slowly go up and eventually you'd see the whole room. No one gets out of this thing alive. No one gets out of it. And I just thought, it's enough with chains. It's enough with disappearing people. And whatever I can do to impact that is what I wanted to do.
I've known you a long time, and I've known you not as long. But I feel like I've known you.
Is that another age?
I was there with you when I met you, so I'm just old. Yeah. No, I met Asha 12 years ago, and she was 15 at the time.
Why is that funny? I feel like this is a little rude. Does Philly hate on Brooklyn?
But I met Patrice 3 years ago, probably this week or last week. Yeah, can you believe it? In Palestine, we went on a delegation to Palestine, Dream Defender. So, and we got to spend a couple of weeks together, and I learned a great deal about you and your character, how principled you are. You don't know how to pack for the Middle East. But a girl from LA in January in Palestine with no coat, it's the Middle East, we good. It's snowing. But one of the things that struck me when we were there, when I went back, Omar Barghouti, one of the leaders of BDS, said to me, do you all realize how significant what you're doing is? And then he specifically referenced you and said, please let Patrice know. I don't know if I told you this. I probably should have. It's recording, right? He said, please let Patrice know that she is making history, that all of them are making history, and that the world is watching. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know that she's one of the most humble people you'll ever meet as well. But do you ever take a moment to consider what this means in the sweep of history, the work you do, what this book will mean in the sweep of history? Do you think about this stuff? And how do you think about it?
Oh, Omar. Yeah, I gotta hit him up. That's really sweet and kind. No, I probably should do it more, because I definitely encourage other folks who I think are doing amazing work that they should be patting themselves on the back more. And I think part of what's hard when you, I'll just start here and then go back to the question, which is, I wish Black folks were free.
There we go.
So while I'm proud of the work that we've done, I am, and I feel grateful for it. What I am still longing for something that doesn't exist yet, and I think that's just a contradiction that I sit with. You know, I'm longing for the day where I never have to visit a jail cell again because they don't exist anymore. I'm longing for the day where I don't feel scared when a cop car pulls up behind me because they don't exist anymore. And until that day, I think the way I sort of orient myself around the work is I just got to keep grinding. And so, but what I appreciate about that question is that it is really important that we claim our victories.
Yes.
It is very important for our morale, for our. You can clap on that. It's important for our morale. It's important for the work that we do. You know, the right claims everything. They claim their victories all the time. And so we have to, I think sometimes in our movement we're a little bit too bent on perfection. But I do think it's no small feat that 3 Black women were able to galvanize the world around 3 words. So
you have changed the world, and you need to own and appreciate that. You have literally changed the world, and that matters. All of it does. Let's take some questions from the audience.